Thank you, Beth, and thank you to the Juneau Public Library for having me, and also for Brenda and Hearthside Books for also co-sponsoring this. I live on Orcas Island in San Juan Islands, as Beth mentioned, and I came up just a couple of days ago, and I was at Ketchikan and then Sitka yesterday, and then flew out on the early plane here this morning, and then I'll be in and around a number of other Alaskan communities for the next 3, 4, 5 days, and then I go to Boston, where this grant came from, and I'm there for a bit, and then Florida before I go home. And the book came out in February, and since then I've been on the road more than I've been home. And I have a life at home. I have a family and a son and a wife, and so I can't be away for too long at any one stretch. So what happened, I'd go away for 3 or 4 days and then back again and then out again. So it wasn't quite as efficient as it could have been. And I felt in some ways like I was flitting all over the country, because I went down to LA and San Francisco, for example, I think 6 or 7 times in the last 4 or 5 months, and the East Coast about 7 times. And probably the most extreme experience of that was going to Washington, D.C. to talk at Politics and Prose for one evening, a 1-hour evening, and then turn around and came back. I didn't even reset my watch. So it's been wonderful, because as some of you who are writers know, that a writer's life is very solitary, and you spend hours and hours and hours in a small room, usually, with just yourself and your computer and your books and your research and so forth. And then the time comes when the book comes out. And then you find out, what happens when your book or your baby goes out into the world and engaging with people. It's a really different experience. One is very solitary, and of course one is not. And but I love this. I love this part of it. I love engaging with people. It's been really wonderful to meet people all over the place that have different relationships with the tide and really interesting questions about their relationship with the tide. But it has been a little bit dizzying moving around. But I'm really glad that I'm here with you in Chicago tonight. I mean, Juneau. As Beth mentioned, I founded and ran a nonprofit educational organization for about 11 years. That was founded in Seattle in the early 80s. And we did seminars on this big old schooner up and down the coast. And you're going to hear more about that a little bit later. But I spent a fair amount of time in Juneau and the other Southeast Alaska communities during that time. So it's been a while since I've been here, but I feel in some ways like it's a homecoming for me. And I feel a bit nostalgic about being here in Alaska and in the Alaska communities. I'll bet you that a lot of you know what this is, but it is a tidal bore. And a tidal bore is when the tide goes up a river in the form of a wave or a solid wall of water. You probably all know this because of the famous one you have in Cook Inlet. But what you're seeing here is, this is in China. It's on the Chentong River just south of Shanghai, and we're about 50 miles from the ocean. And on that right-hand side there, that is the river at low tide, and of course the sun's reflection. And then on the left-hand side here is the bore moving from left to right, about 15 miles per hour. And I was surprised when I did my research to learn that there are actually a lot of these around the world. There are 100 and counting. There's many of them around the UK. There's 5 of them in the Bay of Fundy. They're not big, but there are. And there's some in India. There's a 15-foot tidal bore that goes up the Amazon River. And it can be seen and felt about 500 miles up that river. There's a surf contest there every year at the mouth of the Amazon. But this tidal bore on the Chentong River is the largest in the world. And it gets up to 25 feet tall. And it comes in on every tide twice a day. And it's done that for about 2,500 years. It used to go up the Yangtze, in fact, that shares the mouth of the Chentong. Again, this is just south of Shanghai, and the nearest city upriver is Hangzhou. And this tide as you can imagine, there's a long, long history of mythology and literature and poetry and science around this tide. In fact, the first tide chart in the world showed up here in 1000 AD. And it was etched in stone, and it predicted the arrival of the boar. That was 200 years before the first tide chart appeared in the West for the London Bridge in 1200. So there it is in full force. And it's not 25 feet every time it comes upriver, of course. It varies. And it gets up to 25 feet when it's coincident with a large storm in the East China Sea. And that's something that's not entirely predictable. The chart can predict its arrival generally and its size generally every day, but it can't predict what happens when there's a large storm. So when this happens, it jumps the jetties, typically, and it floods acres and acres of farmland. And every year, people drown in this tidal bore. In fact, I don't know for sure, but you can see that those people were definitely swept off their feet and probably swept inland. Maybe some of them swept back into the river. But this happens frequently. And part of it is that there's a festival in China every fall that is, it's called a Mooncake Festival. And millions of people come to basically pay homage to the river. And really, literally, millions of people come. They come from all over China, and they stand along the river. And often that's when the accidents happen, because people are lulled into the riverbed, and they don't suspect that the boar is going to come when it comes, or as large as it is. And for this chapter, in fact, I met a man who lost his son to the boar just a month or two before I got there. And he wanted to tell me about it because he wanted people to understand how dangerous the tidal bore was. So he took me deep into the fish market in Hangzhou, and we sat down, and for an hour he told me the whole detailed story of losing his son to the boar. So before I go on, I want to just mention three amazing facts about the tide. And these are three of many, many that I discovered along the way. And it's partly what kept me in this research and writing. I had no idea just how complex and fascinating it was. But here's just three facts among many again. First, that the tide is a long, low wave that travels around the world at 450 miles per hour, the speed of a modern jet. And the irony of it is we don't experience it as a fast-moving phenomenon. In fact, the other way around, right? When we are on the coast, and if we stood there long enough, we would see first the trough of that wave, low tide. And then about 6 hours later, we would see the crest of that wave, high tide. And then about another 6 hours later, we would see the next trough. So we would have to be there 12 hours to watch a wave pass. But it's moving at 450 miles per hour. It's fully charged. There's no beginning and no end. For 99.999% of human history, we had no idea how the tides worked. It really wasn't until the end of the scientific revolution when Newton and his colleagues gave us the laws of gravity and planetary motion so that we could even get a grip on what was going on. And it's taken us over 300 years since then to know what we know today. And we know a lot, but we don't know everything. But think of it, for all those years before 1700, generally speaking, the worldview was that the Earth was the center of the universe and it didn't move. And with that kind of worldview, there's no way you could understand how the tides actually work. Yet, for all those years, certainly our ancestors who settled along the coast, because that was where it was easy to make a living, developed a really keen, practical understanding of the relationship between what they saw up there and what they saw down here going on in the intertidal zone, where they made their living. And that knowledge was passed on from generation to generation to generation. So, for example, they saw the relationship between a full moon and a new moon and large tides, right? High highs and low lows. I mean, that was obvious. They probably also saw, of course, the relationship between a wind that was blowing with the tide that brought it in faster and higher, or a wind against the tide that pushed it back and made it lower. They also saw that when there was a weather system, a low front, what we call a low front system, it relieved pressure on the ocean, so the ocean lifted up, so they had higher tides during a storm front. And during a high pressure system, when there was intense sunshine, that pressed down on the ocean, so they had lower tides that time. They also saw for sure that sometimes the moon, the full moon, appeared larger in the sky, and they had larger tides. And sometimes it appeared smaller in the sky. And we know today that's because the moon doesn't circle the Earth in a perfect circle, right? It's oblong, it's eccentric. Sometimes it's closer to the Earth and exerting more gravitational pull, and sometimes it's further away. So for certain they developed all these subtleties and because it was critical for their survival. But they didn't know how it worked. Yet I imagine that if all of us were out on the coast here and we had collected our oysters or clams or whatever it was for the day, and we had a fire on the beach and the full moon came up, we would wonder, how does the moon do it? How does the moon reach out over all that distance and silently and invisibly stir the waters of the earth? Of course, nobody knew, but there was a lot of speculation. Some people thought that the moon did it by heating rocks on the bottom of the ocean. And when those rocks were warmed, the water warmed, it swelled, and that was high tide. And when the moon went away, the rocks cooled, the water cooled and contracted, and that was low tide. That's one of the most plausible theories I came across. It's actually not bad at all. But some people thought, like astrologers, thought it was divine influence. And they cited women's menstrual cycles and the tide as evidence of that on Earth. Lots of people thought it was breathing, like the breathing of the earth itself, the long inhale and exhale of the earth. Leonardo da Vinci was convinced it was the breathing of a large beast, and he tried to calculate the size of its lung. And in Haida Gwaii, high tide woman made high tide by lifting her skirt. So there are a lot of theories like this, and it went on and on and on. But again, they didn't know how it worked. It took until the 17th century to start to piece this thing together. And interestingly, Newton's book, the Principia Mathematica, is a tome, right? It's a big, thick book. And I spent some time with it at the Royal Society in London. There's only 4 pages of it that address the tide. Yet, his theory is still the fundamental theory that we use today. It's wrong, but it's the fundamental theory, the equilibrium theory. So it wasn't complete at all, but it was the first attempt to piece together this whole story with gravity. And none of those scientists, by the way, wanted anything to do with gravity. Gravity was a hot potato. It was part of the ancient world that they were all trying to get rid of. They wanted a mechanistic world. They wanted to be able to explain tides like hitting a billiard ball and it hitting another ball and another ball. In fact, Descartes was convinced that the atmosphere, the ether, was like jello. And as the moon moved through it, it pushed the jello, and the jello pushed down on the earth, on the oceans of the earth, because they could not conceive of this spooky, silent, invisible force. And even Newton, when he plunked gravity in the middle of his theory, he hated it. In fact, he said, "Don't blame this on me, but I can't find anything else that works." So the last fact, before I go on, is that tides create friction, a lot of it, by rubbing against the ocean floor. Every little eddy that we see on the coast here is evidence of that friction, the rubbing of the tide against the ocean floor. There is so much of that cumulatively around the world that it functions as a force that slows down the rotation of the earth. So by a very small amount every day, our days are getting longer and the earth is turning slower. 400 million years ago, our day was 21 hours long, not 24, because of the tide. And that same force is pushing the moon away at the rate of about 10 feet in a human lifetime. So again, many millions of years ago, the moon was much closer to the Earth. And the speculation is that we had tides of 100 to 200 feet, and they happened every couple of hours, completely washing over the land. A very hostile environment, if there was anything living there or trying to live there. So I'm switching now to talk a little bit about my history and how I got into the book. I grew up on the California coast, as Beth said, surfing, sailing, diving. I felt like I always had a tide chart in my back pocket, probably like a lot of you. And I built a boat out of school, and I sailed that boat down the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Atlantic. And then I came back up to Seattle in the early 80s, and I thought I was going to go back to school. And while I was searching for a program, I saw a picture of a big old wooden schooner called Crusader. And I felt a little crush coming on, so I got in my Volkswagen Bug and I drove down to Tillamook, Oregon, and the boat was halfway up the bay, and I went down below, and the owners had a wood stove going. It was drippy, cold, winter day, kind of like, not like today, but yesterday maybe. And I could smell rotting wood, and the boat was painted all orange, and it leaked about 150 gallons a day, and it was perfect. So I bought the boat, and I started a school on the boat, the nonprofit educational organization. And for the next 11 years, we sailed that boat from Seattle up to Southeast Alaska, around Haida Gwaii and Vancouver Island, and did these seminars. And we had naturalists come on board, and writers and psychologists, and whale biologists and musicians. We had Paul Winter on board, and we played music while we floated among the glaciers in Glacier Bay. A lot of different folks, and we had a wonderful time. But one not so wonderful time was going aground in Kalinan Bay. We were coming back from a seminar up on the outside of Chichagof Island with anthropologist and writer Richard Nelson. And it was the last day of the seminar, and the weather was beautiful like today. But I heard on the radio that they were predicting a gale. So I picked a protected anchorage, a bight, Kalinan Bay on the north tip of Kruzof Island, and we went in there and we had a quiet dinner and went to bed. And I got up at about 4 in the morning, and I was relieving myself off the stern, and I noticed that something wasn't right. And those of you who have been on boats, and I think that's probably all of you, know that when you walk on a boat that's floating, there's a resonance underfoot, a hollowness. And it's a little hard to describe, but it's very clear when it's not there. It feels more like you're walking on concrete. And indeed, that's what had happened. We had dragged anchor in the gale all the way across the bay and oozed into the mud. And it turns out that right when I discovered that, looking at my tide chart, we are at the top of a high tide, a 16-foot tide. So here I was in my underwear, my rubber boots. It's 4 in the morning, it's blowing a gale, and I have 12 paying passengers on board. So we got everybody off the boat, and Nels stood by with a rifle because there was bear sign everywhere. And to make a long story short, the boat went all the way down, and it got stuck in the mud. And instead of coming back up with the next tide, it just flooded. So by mid-morning, we were swimming through the cabins of the boat. And I thought we were going to lose the boat, but at the very last minute, thanks to the Coast Guard in large part, because they dropped off 3 pumps and gasoline, and they had other distress calls up the coast, so they said, this is all we can do for you right now. We've got to go take care of these other boats. But we got those 3 pumps going and finally got enough water out of the boat that she popped back up. And it completely submerged the engine, and all the electrics were fried. And so we sent the participants back to Sitka in a fish boat, and 2 crew and I stayed behind. And the next morning, we ran under our own steam back to Sitka. I pulled the engine apart and flushed it with fresh water, and we rewired it enough so that we could get the boat going. And then 3 days later, we went out on the next seminar. Yeah, we had 30 people working around the clock and equipment coming in and out of Seattle to get it back going again. So after that experience, I vowed to learn about the tide. I mean, what I often say is I got the tide out of Crusader, but I couldn't get it out of my head. And I knew that the moon had something to do with it, but I wasn't sure what. And I thought that I'd read a book or two or an article or two and take a couple of weeks and pretty much learn everything there was to know about the tide. But I was really wrong. And as I said earlier, the more I read, the more fantastic, the more complex, the more poetic it became. So I got hooked. And a couple of articles turned into 10, and then 50, and then 100, and then 300. And a couple of weeks turned into 10 years before I knew it. And I wrote a couple of articles, and then I got married, and we had a child, and we moved to Orcas Island. And I didn't forget about the tides for a while, but I took a break. And then I committed to writing this book about 7 years ago. And the reason I wrote the book was, I love to read pure science. I love to read textbooks. But the more I read, the more I felt that something was missing. And I wanted to bring in the humanity. I wanted to bring in the human story about the tides, the poetry of it, the spirit of it. Because as I was learning, more and more people, coastal people like yourselves, I'm sure, feel a spiritual, deep, deep connection with the coast and the tides. So I wanted to bring that into it. And basically what I did was I took some element of the tide and I went to where it was most dramatically at play in the world. And so I go there, I'm talking about what's happening. There's often what I call a hero in the story, somebody I'm following along, a scientist or a writer or a monk or whoever it is, a surfer in one case. And I'm kind of seeing the tide through that person, but it's also an adventure and, of course, a world travel story. So for a chapter on waves and how the tide is like a wave and how it's not like a wave, I went to the surf contest at Mavericks, west of San Francisco. And I met there with a surfer there, Greg Long, who's one of the world-class surfers. And I went out on the press boat right up in the lineup. And turns out that just a couple of months before this contest, Greg had almost died in an accident on the Cortez Bank, just off about 60 miles off the coast of San Diego. And he was out in about 70-foot waves. And it turns out he fell and was held down by 3 set waves and blacked out. And they pronounced him dead, but he was revived. And so he tells me that story in that chapter in detail. And it's amazing because, when people go through an experience like that, it's one thing to actually want to revisit it. But it's another thing to be absolutely articulate about every second of the experience, which he was. He talked exactly about being down, being held down, how deep he was, and the moment when he realized he was going to black out and what he should do, whether he should race for the last 1 or 2 seconds for the surface, where he could get clobbered by the next wave, or whether he should stay down. But anyway, it's a fascinating story. And then mixed into that, of course, is how the tide is like a wave and not. And then for a chapter on the cultural and spiritual history of tides, I went to Mont Saint-Michel. And there's a 45-foot tide there, completely wrapping the monastery. The monastery is on the west side of France, the Normandy coast, and it's the largest tide in mainland Europe. And this monastery was built in the 7th century. It's a Benedictine monastery, and it's been used as a place of spiritual practice for all of its life, except a couple of years during World War II when it was a prison. But there are monks and sisters that live there, and I wanted to go there and meet these people because I figured that they were plunked right in the middle of this tidal phenomenon that was happening at their feet, basically. And I figured that there must be some influence with their spiritual practice, and I wanted to know what that was. But it was very difficult to get to them. This is a UNESCO heritage site, and there's millions of visitors that come here. So the monks they're very secretive, and they float around, they disappear into these doors. I couldn't get to them. So when I left, I hired a guide there who translated my letters to the monks, and it took 2 years. And I finally got permission to a silent lunch and a half-hour interview. And I got to pick the tide, so I picked the largest tide of the year in the late fall, and I got my lunch, and the half-hour interview turned into an hour. So this chapter is kind of all around that meeting and what the monks had to say. But one of the interesting things about this situation, and it's not unlike a number of places here in Alaska and all around the UK, but these flats are so, the gradation is so low here that when the tide is out, the ocean is up to 10 miles away, and you don't see it. But if you go to the top of the monastery, as I did, and if you watch for long enough, when the tide turns, you see this molten silver thread on the horizon. And then within minutes, the tide is just racing across these flats. A naturalist there said that if you're out there and the tide gets to your feet, within 2 minutes it will be at your waist and carry you away. Then for a chapter on tide energy, I went to the north tip of Scotland, the Orkney Islands, where there's an organization there called European Marine Energy Center, and they are doing the most research in the world on tide and wave energy. They've got devices going in and out of the water all the time. And just for scale, a human is about the size of one of those canisters there. And then for that same chapter, I went down to the southern tip of Chile. And they've got tremendous tide energy resources there, and a large incentive to exploit them, but nothing in the water yet. And I went down to a conference there with a Scottish consultant, and they're anxious to get devices in the water because there's really not much of a grid south of Portimão, which is about the last third of Chile, and which is an archipelago not unlike here. And there's lots of small communities, and they're operating on generators, most of them. So small, appropriate-sized tide energy devices will go a long way there in helping them to live down there. I imagine that within the next 5 years, they will have devices in the water. And then for a chapter that I call Ancient and Future Tides, where I talk about sea level and tides over time, I went to 2 places also. This is the San Blas Islands, just east of Panama, and it's a 350 island archipelago that stretches almost all the way down to Colombia. And it's occupied by the Cunayala Indians. There's about 35,000 Cunayala Indians that live here. And as you can see, they're very low-lying islands. I think the highest elevation in all the islands is 2 to 3 feet. And the tides are not large there. They're 10 inches, 12 inches, but they are always at their ankles. And they have 2 views of the tide. One is a traditional view that tells them that the tide is a spiritual visitor from another dimension, come to check up on the village. And it comes into the village to see if everything is okay. And if it is, it goes, it returns. But if it's not, it stays. And then they have sober-minded scientists within their community that tell them if sea level rises 3 feet in the next 50 years, as it's conservatively estimated to do there, they will lose all their island homes and have to find another place to live. And they have land on the mainland that they're trying to clean up and create for their new settlements. But they move ahead with both these views, that it is a spiritual problem, but it's also a scientific problem, and it's something that's very practical that they have to start to make provisions to move. They're famous for these molas. I'm sure you've seen them. And then for that same chapter, I went to Venice. And as probably all of you know, Venice was founded in, I think, the 5th century AD, and it's had tide flooding problems ever since it was founded. It was exacerbated in the last 50 years because they were extracting groundwater, and as a consequence, the land was sinking. But they've stopped that, but the land is still sinking. And today, San Marco Square floods 70 times a year. And these wooden platforms are called passerellas, and they're always left in stacks around the city. So when there's going to be a large tide, and everybody knows it, everybody gets a text, or there's sirens throughout the city. This is a walking city, right? So everybody knows what the tide's doing. Just like anybody that spends any time on the water here always knows what the tide's doing. And when they know it's going to be high and some parts of the city are going to be flooded, the public works people come out and set up these platforms. The hotels issue rubber boots to everybody that goes there. And all the Venetians have rubber boots. Some of them have hip waders. And they know their way around the city when the tide is flooding, just like somebody in Seattle would know their way around the city during rush hour. They know what streets to take, or how to walk so they avoid the deepest water. There's a bookstore in Venice that's at the lowest elevation in Venice. It's called Acqua Alta. And it always stays open, and it always floods. It's a tiny bookstore, and it's crowded with books, but they're up off the ground in bathtubs and kayaks and gondolas. And the guy who owns this old grumpy guy. And another thing that's interesting about Venice is we're so accustomed to seeing the tide on the coast. Like it belongs there. We never even imagine that it doesn't belong there. But in Venice, it doesn't come from the coast. It bubbles up through the cobblestone, in little slots in the cobblestone, through the stormwater, and then disappears down those same slots. So there's slots in the bookstore in Acqua Alta. And I went there during one of the highest tides of the year and was wearing my rubber boots and wading through this store looking at books. And he barks at people. He says, "Don't splash and don't make any waves." But otherwise people are browsing them like they would any other bookstore. One of the unique things about Venice, and different than the San Blas Islands, is that it's a lagoon, right? And it's got sand spits that protect it from the Adriatic Sea. And on those sand spits, there's 3 small openings. And what they're doing now is they're building gates. It's called the Mose Project. They're building gates for those 3 openings so that when they know there's going to be one of the largest tides, those gates will come up and protect the city from the highest tides. But over the public process of 20 years, they concluded that they would live with that kind of tide. That's okay. But that kind of tide is not. So then for the largest tides in the world, I went to 2 places, the Bay of Fundy and the Arctic. And the interesting thing about these places is the record tide in the Bay of Fundy is 54 feet 6 inches, which is not just 6 inches or a foot higher than the next highest tide. It's 10 feet higher than the next tide. So I went into this chapter exploring, like, why would you have a tide like that in one place or 2 places in the world? What's going on there? Or why wouldn't you have a tide in the Baltic or the Mediterranean, or a very, very small one, or the Gulf of Mexico? So I found out, of course, that there's a competing high tide in Ungava Bay, which is about 1,300 miles north of the Bay of Fundy. And the Bay of Fundy is on the east side of Canada, just above Maine. And this is an Inuit community, and it's just about 200 miles south of the Arctic Circle. And I went up, like a lot of the places I went to more than once. I eventually just packed my bag and went up to a place called Tetsuyak in the summertime to witness this high tide. And I walked back and forth in this very small town, And eventually, on my way back out, I stopped at the hub, which is Kuujjuaq, and I overheard a conversation with a native man and somebody else about digging a hole in the winter ice and going underneath during low tides, exceptional low tides, when it's hollow underneath the ice, and hunting for fresh blue mussels. And of course my ears perked up, and after the conversation I introduced myself to this man, Lucas Inapaluk, and eventually he asked me to join him under the ice. So of course I was very excited. I went home and I rented Arctic gear and I was ready to go, and that too took about 2.5 years to finally come to fruition. I'd call like we had agreed through the winter, and he'd say, no, not right. No, not right. And then finally, about 2.5 years later, I called him and he said, come now. So I grabbed my gear and I went on progressively smaller planes and finally landed in Kangasuiaq, his village, on a cargo plane with a bunch of Coca-Cola and ammunition. And I spent about a week with him. And what they do is they sharpen a long steel rod. And again, the ice and tide conditions have to be just right. And they chop a hole in the ice. Well, this is a tradition that is about at least a couple hundred years old. And it's been passed on from generation to generation. And not everybody in the village does it. There's about 200 people in this village and about 300 sled dogs. And there's only about a handful of people that have been trained to do this, to know what the signs are to make it safe to do it, because accidents do happen. So I have a section of this chapter to read, and I was debating whether to read or not, but I think I'm going to. Is that okay? Everybody game for that? This is just a piece of this chapter. Lucas, he stops, and I'm on his snowmobile. We're going out towards Hudson Strait. Lucas, he stops and turns off the engine, asking me to wait while he pokes around. No, he says, returning, not right. Several minutes later, we stop again. This time he comes back with a hint of excitement on his usually stolid face. We gather the shovel and torque and hike over a bank of buckled ice, stopping at a long, steepled fracture. Lucas, he squats for a closer look at a jagged opening. Satisfied, he removes his jacket and chisels at the fracture for half an hour until he breaks through the 3-foot thick ice, shaping a hole about 20 inches in diameter. He wastes no time, no strokes. The window of opportunity opens a couple hours before low tide and snaps shut 4 hours later. This is a window no one wants to miscalculate. Stabbing the torque into the ice so it stands on its own, Lucasy again asks me to wait while he inspects the cavity. His caution, like that of any good hunter, is reasonable, but I am not at all prepared for the feeling of being left suddenly alone while my guide vanishes down a dark hole. I take in, hesitantly, just how alone I am, and just how vast and beautiful and deadly the frozen landscape is. The bay surface appears quiet and still, but in fact the tide keeps it in constant motion, breaking the silence now and then with ghostly moans and jolting explosions like gunshot as the ice adjusts to the ever-changing conditions below. Before I can think about this too much, Lucasy's head bobs back up through the hole. It's good, he says. Lots of mussels and room to forage. He has carved a small foothold in the opening, but the diameter of the hole is too small to allow my knees to bend. After struggling a bit, I realize the only way down is to straighten out and slide. So I do. I let go and drop, landing 6 or 7 feet below the surface in a pile of ice and rock and seaweed. It wasn't pretty. For several minutes, I am completely disoriented by this instant plunge from a bright, frigid upper world into a dark, warm underworld. My glasses and camera fog instantly. The air is close to sea temperature, 40 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 60 degrees warmer than 7 feet above my head. As my eyes adapt to the dimness, I notice that the tent-like cavity has a 5-foot-high center ridge that parallels the shoreline. The sides taper out, leaving a foraging area of about 20 feet wide and 100 feet long. The seafloor drops in places, allowing enough headroom for me to stand upright. Muted blue light penetrates from above where the ice is thin or fractured. Bits of seaweed and detritus cling randomly to the ceiling, evidence of the last high tide. A crab skitters across the rock and disappears under the seaweed. As I adjust to the eerie surroundings, my breath shallow and quick, I feel like I have dropped into an entirely unknown and unexpected realm, as if the tiny hole carved by Lucasy allowed us to slip mysteriously not just under the ice, but under the surface of the sea. Here, in a dreamlike state, I feel inside the body of the ocean. So that's me, and that's Lucasy Napaluk there. And that's his village, Kangasuiak. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and just talk a little bit about the science and introduce this film, and that's and then afterwards I can take some questions if you have them. What I discovered about the tides, and partly what kept me going, was that it's many, many layered. The more I learned, it seemed the more I needed to know. And the frustration with this process is not new at all to the field. Aristotle, in fact, is rumored to have killed himself because he couldn't understand the tides back in the 4th century BC. He threw himself into the ocean saying, comprehend me since I cannot comprehend thee. And then later, Laplace said it's the thorniest problem in science. And I sat with a world-renowned tide modeler in the Bay of Fundy, David Greenberg, not that long ago. And I asked him, I said, can you describe an aha moment? And he was quiet for a little bit, and then he said, I don't have aha moments with the tide, only oh God moments when the tide does something I never thought it would do. So the challenges about understanding the tide are not new, but they're old, and they continue. But you can divide the subject into two pieces broadly. One is what's happening up there, which we all know is astronomy, which essentially is about the relationships of the Earth, Moon, and Sun. And then part two is what's happening down here, what we call in the ocean fluid dynamics. So basically it's the ocean's response to what's happening up there. And up there, you've got all of these different relationships going on that we talked about earlier, that are the native people, of course, on the coast all recognize. The full moon, new moon, quarter moon, three-quarter moon, moon closest to the Earth called perigee, moon farthest from the Earth called epigee. Even our revolution around the sun is not equidistant, right? We're closest to the sun in January. So that's when the sun's having its largest effect on the tide. And we're furthest in July. So there's all these different relationships. And you can freeze them, and that's what scientists do. You freeze them, you call them beats or pulses or whatever, and you assign a relationship between that pulse, say the new moon or full moon, and what's happening in the ocean. If you boil this subject down long enough, what you get to is vibration. And more specifically, resonance, when something vibrates in response to something else. And we all know that, what resonance is. We experience it every day. You know, when you pluck a guitar string, the bass of the guitar, the body of the guitar resonates with those plucked strings, and the sound gets amplified, right? Gets richer. When we drive down a rutted road, if we drive at just the right speed, our car resonates with the the ruts in the road, and it feels like it's going to shake apart. If we slow down or we speed up, it breaks the resonance. It dampens it, they say. I play tennis, and if you guys play tennis, you know you put a dampener on your string because your strings, your racket can resonate with the hitting of the ball. So you put a little dampener there so it doesn't happen. We also know it when we sing in the shower. Every shower stall has a tendency to resonate with certain notes, and it happens that those notes are the notes that we can sing. So if you're in the shower stall and you're singing along at C and D, or singing a song, and suddenly the shower stall resonates with your voice gets rich and full, and sometimes your chest cavity will vibrate and your skull cavity, and you feel brilliant because the music is so rich, right? Well, that's resonance, and every shower stall, by the way, resonates differently. So your shower stall at home might resonate with a C, but the shower stall in your hotel might resonate with a D or an F. It depends on the shape of the stall. Okay, so what in the hell does this have to do with the tide? Well, it's just like that. If you blow up that analogy, the singing are all these different relationships of the earth, moon, and sun in the sky. And scientists have identified over 400 of these, right? Again, new moon, full moon, three-quarter, perigee, epigee, and so on. Over 400 of these that have a tide signature on Earth. And the shower stalls are the ocean basins of the world. And when we look out on the ocean, most of us think it's one basin, right? The Pacific is one basin, and it is, but there are many, many, many other basins within that basin, and they're all shaped by the topography, the length, the width of those shapes, how deep they are. Even the water temperature and salinity contribute to how it's going to vibrate and how it's going to respond to something else in the sky. So, great. So I just have a couple of concluding remarks, and then if you have some questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. As I mentioned earlier, since Newton and his colleagues gave us a fingerhold on how the tides work, we know a lot more about the tides now. Of course, we know a lot about it. In fact, in terms of this resonance, the method used to come up with the tide charts that we understand the tides today is called harmonic analysis. So it's all about this resonance now. There's a lot of mysteries, as I said, that are still to be resolved. And one of them is what the relationship is between the tides and seismic activity, volcanoes and earthquakes and so forth. It's been assumed for a long time that there is a relationship, but it hasn't been fully proved yet. And not only does it make good common sense that the tugging with gravitation, the pull from the the sun and the moon would have an effect, but also all that weight of water sloshing around the earth. I mean, think of it, of a 20-foot tide, it's a tremendous amount of weight that comes up on the land and then goes away. So I think in the future we're going to find out a lot about that. And then one other piece has to do with biological rhythms, what they call chronobiology in that field. And that we know that there are lots and lots and lots of creatures in the intertidal zone that are tuned to either lunar or tidal rhythms. In fact, the first chapter of this book, I talk about a mud shrimp the size of a grain of rice, a chirophium, that lives in the Bay of Fundy in that low tide there. And it has two tide clocks in its body. One that tells them what the tide is doing every day, and another that tells it what the largest tides of the month are for spawning purposes. So two clocks in that little body, and we don't know where they are, and we don't know how they work. So there's going to be a lot of work in this in the future, and a number of scientists that I talked to were convinced that as we learn more about this, we're going to learn that there are residual rhythms, lunar and tidal rhythms within the human body as well. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions.